Welcome to this in-depth exploration of one of the most chilling and disturbing cases in American crime history. Richard Trenton Chase, infamously known as the Vampire of Sacramento. His gruesome acts of violence left an indelible mark on the true crime landscape, making him one of the most terrifying killers of the 20th century. Over the course of a little more than a month, Richard Chase embarked on a horrifying killing spree that would shock an entire nation. But who was the man behind these horrific crimes? What drove him to commit such brutal acts of violence? And how did he come to be known as a cannibalistic killer? Let's dive into the life and crimes of Richard Chase and try to understand what led him down this dark path. Richard Trenton Chase was born on May 23, 1950, in Sacramento, California. His early years, like many other notorious killers, were marred by dysfunction and instability. Chase's parents had a tumultuous relationship, marked by constant arguments and, at times, physical altercations. Richard's mother was known to be paranoid and controlling, and his father often resorted to alcohol to cope with their rocky marriage. And from a young age, he exhibited signs of emotional and mental instability. As a child, Chase was withdrawn and struggled to make friends. He was often described as shy and detached from his peers. While some children find solace in hobbies or creative outlets, Chase's early years were characterized by cruelty toward animals, a classic indicator of deeper psychological problems. He would often torture and kill small animals, a disturbing trait that would later manifest in even more horrific ways. By the time Richard reached his teenage years, his mental health had deteriorated significantly. He started abusing drugs and alcohol, which only exacerbated his existing issues. His behavior became increasingly erratic, and he started to develop hypochondriac tendencies, that his heart had stopped beating and that his blood was turning into powder. This delusion would be a precursor to the gruesome acts that would follow. As Chase entered adulthood, his mental health took a severe turn for the worse. He moved out of his parents' home and into an apartment with friends, but his roommates quickly noticed something was wrong. Richard would wander around the apartment naked, claiming that he was absorbing vitamin C through his skin. He would also inject himself with animal blood, convinced that it would cure his various ailments. Eventually, his roommates could no longer tolerate his bizarre behavior and asked him to leave. With nowhere to go, Chase returned to his mother's home. However, instead of receiving the help he desperately needed, his mother rejected the idea that anything was wrong with him. She refused to believe that he needed psychiatric treatment and even took him off his medication. This lack of support only accelerated Chase's descent into madness. He became obsessed with the idea that his blood was turning to powder, and that he needed to consume the blood of animals to survive. He started capturing small animals, killing them, and drinking their blood in a twisted attempt to cure himself. His obsession with blood would soon escalate into something far more horrifying. In 1977, Richard Chase was briefly institutionalized after being found injecting rabbit blood into his veins. While in the hospital, he earned the nickname Dracula from the staff due to his obsession with blood. Despite his clearly unstable mental state, Chase was released after just a short time, deemed no longer a danger to society. This decision would prove to be catastrophic. Upon his release, Chase's delusions grew even more intense. He became convinced that he needed human blood to survive, and in December of 1977, he committed his first murder. His victim was Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old engineer who was shot and killed while helping his wife unload groceries. This random act of violence marked the beginning of Chase's killing spree. Unlike other serial killers, who often stalk their victims or have a specific pattern, Chase's attacks were chaotic and impulsive. He would simply break into homes and kill whoever was inside, often drinking their blood and mutilating their bodies. His second murder occurred just 1 month after the first, when he broke into the home of Teresa Wallen, a 22-year-old woman who was 3 months pregnant. Chase brutally murdered her, then proceeded to engage in acts of necrophilia and cannibalism, drinking her blood and removing her organs. Chase's violent spree reached its peak on January 27, 1978, when he broke into the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Meredith. Inside the house were Evelyn, her 6-year-old son Jason, her 22-month-old nephew David, and her friend Dan Meredith. What Chase did inside that home defies explanation. He shot and killed Dan first, then proceeded to murder Evelyn, Jason, and little David. He mutilated their bodies, drank their blood, and, in one of the most horrifying details of the case, cannibalized parts of their flesh. When Evelyn's friend came by later that afternoon to check on her, she discovered the grisly scene and immediately called the police. By this point, the Sacramento police were frantically searching for the killer. They had found Chase's fingerprints at the crime scenes. But it was a witness who finally led to his capture, after seeing a sketch of the suspect on the news. A woman who had previously encountered Chase reported him to the police. On January 27, 1978, Richard Chase was arrested at his apartment. Inside, authorities found disturbing evidence of his crime's blood-stained clothing, a calendar marked with the dates of his murders, and various body parts that he had kept as trophies. Richard Chase's trial began in 1979. His defense team attempted to plead insanity, arguing that Chase was clearly mentally ill and had no control over his actions. However, the prosecution argued that Chase was fully aware of what he was doing and that his premeditation and the horrific nature of his crimes warranted the death penalty. The jury ultimately found Chase guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he was placed on death row. During his time in prison, Chase continued to exhibit signs of severe mental illness. He would often complain that the guards were poisoning his food and that his blood was turning to powder. In December of 1980, Richard Chase took his own life. He overdosed on the antidepressant medication that had been prescribed to him and was found dead in his cell. His death marked the end of a horrifying chapter in American crime history. But the legacy of his brutal crimes would continue to haunt those who remembered the Vampire of Sacramento. The case of Richard Chase is particularly disturbing not just because of the brutality of his crimes, but because of the severe mental illness that played a role in his actions. Chase was diagnosed with schizophrenia, a condition that often leads to delusions, paranoia, and hallucinations in his mind. Chase genuinely believed that he needed to drink blood to survive. He was also deeply disturbed by his belief that his blood was turning to powder, a delusion that drove him to commit his horrific acts of cannibalism. What makes the case of Richard Chase so unsettling is the fact that his mental illness was evident from an early age. Despite clear signs of psychosis, he was repeatedly failed by the system. From his early encounters with mental health professionals to his brief institutionalization in 1977, had Chase received the proper treatment and care, it's possible that his killing spree could have been prevented. The story of Richard Chase is a tragic one, both for his victims and for the man himself. It's a case that highlights the importance of mental health care and the devastating consequences that can result when individuals in need of help slip through the cracks. While Chase's crimes are some of the most disturbing in American history, they also serve as a reminder of the fragile nature of the human mind and the dark paths it can take when left untreated. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the life and crimes of Richard Trenton Chase. As always, we encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below. How do you feel about this case? Should more have been done to prevent Chase from committing these atrocities? Be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more in-depth explorations of history's most notorious killers.